Welcome. Whose first time is this? Awesome. That's great to see a new crowd. My name is Liz Cloppolo. I'm the chapter lead for Voter Choice Massachusetts in the Pioneer Valley. And I think I just want to start off this meeting by celebrating something really exciting that happened this past week in Amherst. I should say last week. Does anybody know what happened? Okay. So Amherst passed a new charter. It was a, divisive kind of fight between the two camps about whether to adopt it or not. But it was, in the end, adopted, and that includes implementation of ranked choice voting, making Amherst the second town in Massachusetts now that will be using ranked choice voting. The first one being Cambridge, Mass., which has used it for the last 70 years for their city council and their school board.
Wow.
So we're excited about that. Yeah.
And actually, one good thing to say about that is that even though the campaign for that charter was quite divisive, the thing that united it was that both sides were unanimous in their use of ranked choice voting. So even had the charter not passed, the people who were on the side of a representative town meeting were really excited about using ranked choice voting to elect their representatives if they were.
And
So
of
that
the
measure was separate from the charter vote?
Nope,
No.
part of the charter.
yeah. And of the charter commission members, I think they were split 5-4 on adoption, but all 9 of them agreed that whatever the outcome, ranked choice voting should be something that Amherst should implement. So that's our exciting news from this past week.
And round of applause. Yay.
We have one Amherst resident, our local adoption lead, who is running a little bit late, but he's been kind of keeping everybody in the loop about what's been happening there. So why don't we just go through some real quick introductions. Like I said, my name is Liz Popolo, and I'm the chapter lead. So I got started with Voter Choice Massachusetts about November, December 2016. And I've been serving in many different capacities, including at the statewide level doing arts and media, videography, photography, stuff like social media stuff. And I've also been heading up this chapter since about January. Last year was our kickoff, so we've been holding solid, and we've got a few more leads to introduce themselves, and then I'd like everyone else to introduce yourselves and what brought you here and what you know about ranked choice voting. So, Linda?
I'm Linda Castronovo, and I'm a volunteer public speaker. So I've been a person who's been trained on how to do this ranked choice voting 101 presentation. I learned about ranked choice voting about a year ago, actually, during my Indivisible group meeting that I attended. And after the election in 2016, I was, I don't know, it coincided with my retirement from teaching and coaching, and I was kind of stunned, as many of us were, but I had lots more time and energy to learn about politics and what went wrong, what happened in that election. And when I learned about ranked choice voting, I remember sitting in that meeting, and I was there for another issue, but I remember saying, oh wow, there's a way out of this. There's a way out of this incredibly maddening swinging from extreme to extreme. And actually, I can do something about it right here in my backyard. Like, I don't have to be so worried about things on such a huge scale that felt so out of reach. So I was really excited to meet this group of people that are so committed to strengthening, the basic democratic values of fair representation and engagement. So that's my story.
And Paul?
I'm Paul Thomas, and I'm the Pioneer Valley Live Outreach lead, and I got involved in this effort after I've been doing election integrity stuff since I tried to figure out what went wrong in Ohio back in 2004. So I've been in that side of the equation for a long time, but this year I was, or 2016, geez. I was a co-founder of a group that tried to bring lawsuits to make sure that primaries could be open in New York and California and so on. But again, the same sentiments coming out of that. What can we do about this? This is ridiculous. And so I saw a notice for the meeting in February when I first caught up with you guys. And and have been doing it ever since.
And so why don't we go around? Feel free to say your name, maybe where you're from, what brought you to be interested in ranked choice voting, and if you have a specific question that you'd like us to try to answer during this meeting, we're happy to take as many questions as possible. I'll write down whatever questions people have. So let's start at this side and go this way. Yeah.
My name's Dan Carey. I'm from East Hampton. I'm on the East Hampton City Council. I'm running for state representative for John Stuyvesant. He's retiring. And ranked choice voting is just something I want to learn more about, the pros and the cons. I hear people who are for it are all for it. And the only con I ever really hear usually is it's new and it's different. So I'm wondering if there's a strong anti-ranked choice voting group out there, or if there's, what the pros and the cons are.
So what are the pros and cons?
I'm Nancy Malkin. I would love to see this happen everywhere, and I talked to everybody in my circle about it, and sometimes people respond like, it's too complicated, and I'm like, is it better to have what we have now? I don't know.
We get the
Can you address
complicated question a lot, and I think there's no better, more pithy way to put it than if you know how to choose your favorites of anything, like your favorite ice cream. Let's say you go to the supermarket and they're out of your favorite flavor of ice cream. Like, do you know how to pick a second choice? Do you know how to pick a third choice if they're out of your second
I
choice?
love that.
That's ranked choice voting, right? So, in the simplest way, yeah. Your name?
Petra Ellis, and I've been interested in ranked voting for a long time. Different flavors is something that I'm very interested in. There's a number of different ways to do it with different pluses and minuses, and I don't know specifically, how targeted you guys are, but having looked at them all, they're generally all better than the status quo.
That's one thing we all agree on, no matter what camp you're from. Yourself?
Hi, I just think this ranked choice voting is just a wonderful idea. I really do, and it was sort of like the last presidential election, when I was really wanted Bernie to win, and I'm not voting for Hillary. I'm a Democrat, obviously. And someone was like, "No, don't throw your vote away," but then I'm thinking, "Oh God, something wrong with this picture." And then when I found out about this, I'm like, geez, now if people did that, we wouldn't have thrown our vote away.
That speaks to some of the recurring issues every election cycle, where there's always going to be accusations of, well, don't throw your vote away, don't waste your vote by voting for someone you like versus someone that's more realistic.
Exactly.
So this is, ranked choice voting is meant to be a solution to that common problem. Not just this election, not just, any presidential election, it happens all across the board. So,
You didn't mention your name though.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name's Rosemary Ware. I live in Florence, and I just recently retired a year ago from. I was a school nurse in Holyoke, and I now need to do some work to make the world a better place for those kids that I had to leave behind.
I know that story.
Sadly, yeah.
I live in East Hampton, and I really like ranked choice. I'd like to see it applied to all offices so that we don't, like school committees and city councils, and just bring it not just to an executive level, or I'd like to see it applied in all fields, that we have multiple choices and be able to do it as such. And I feel like we do a little bit with our local elections, and we have a field. But I'd like to see it applied broadly.
One-
Choice is good.
one interesting local way that it's been used was to elect Amherst College's new mascot. So the Mammoths was chosen through the ranked choice voting system. If they had only used plurality voting, they would have become the purple and white as they phased out their old mascot. But ranked choice voting consolidated a majority of people who wanted the Mammoths as their new mascot. So it has local applications and non-politics as well. And of the folks who have spoken already, do you have any questions that you want to make sure that we cover this evening?
I think you covered in the prior one time frame that this could actually come to a public, statewide, at the very least, statewide applicability, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of folks want to know what are the avenues for pursuing ranked choice voting in different capacities. So we'll cover that. Tom?
Hi, my name's Tom Sturm. I also live in East Hampton. I've been interested in this for a while, since they used to call it IRV, which was instant runoff voting, which is, I guess, at least almost identical to
It's
this.
the same. Yeah.
I know they have it in a lot of countries around the world, and various cities here and there in the U.S. And yeah, it just seems like really one of the most practical, small-scale, like achievable ways to really force real democracy back into the system that we all live in right now. And I think the biggest challenge is just explaining it to people, and because I think most people would probably be in favor of it if they understood it better. And yeah, and I guess I'm here mostly to understand what this effort is about. I'm assuming it's to get like a ballot question or something, or a ballot initiative on the statewide ballot.
Yeah, we're entertaining a few different ideas. Ballot question's certainly one of them. So, yeah. So.
Hi, I'm Bren Mauer, and I live in East Hampton. I've heard about it be called instant runoff voting, and I like how it seems a little more representative. And I think part of the problem is that people get a little disgusted with like two choices that swing one extreme or the other, and it doesn't feel like. Well, it seems like most Americans are pretty progressive, and in their ideas, if not their selection of a party. But so I think that it offers people a little more representation, and really that's the name of the game. And they might not have to shrivel away for 4 years till they get another chance to swing the pendulum the other way, which seems to be in the right direction way more than the left direction. And so I like and what I'd like to know is a very concise, easy way to explain it to people.
Sure. Actually,
Like readily available. Okay, this is it, and it's not complicated. It's pretty brief.
and we've left aside a half an hour at the end of the meeting where we'll all be able to practice a nice simple pitch that you can explain it to somebody who's never heard of it before. So, yeah, that's what we hope to help you all out with.
My name is Peg Coniff. I am also an East Hampton City Councilor, and we almost had a quorum. And I don't know anything about this, so apparently I've been living under a rock. And people that I respect, though, believe very strongly in this. So I thought I would come tonight and just get smarter.
Awesome.
And I have no particular questions other than, I'm sure you'll answer, whatever they are.
I'm sure you'll come out with questions as well that you want to explore further too.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm Stan Diamond. I live in East Hampton. I am extremely interested in this moving forward because I honestly believe that this is the only way that third-party candidates have a chance of succeeding in our current electoral system. And we desperately need that as far as I'm concerned. As far as the complexity issue, somebody, is confused by how this works. I mean, basically every second grader has probably been told once or more, take out a piece of paper and number from 1 to 4. That's how complex it is.
I think on the complexity question, So this also speaks to what is the difference between ranked choice voting and instant runoff voting. And a lot of times they're used synonymously, but one sort of describes more so what the voter's process is. So ranking your choices is more descriptive of the voter's experience, whereas instant runoff voting is more descriptive of the mechanics of how it gets tabulated. And so people think that that question, how is it tabulated, is the complex part.
It's a much better
So-
name.
Yeah.
It is.
And so we'll go through an actual tabulation, and we can actually tabulate the candy question as well. It's vote for your favorite candy candidate.
Well, an instant runoff voting is for a single seat election, and ranked choice voting is more of an umbrella term that you can use to elect a single seat, you know, like a mayor, and single transferable vote. You use exactly the same kind of ballot, the same kind of ranking allows you to seat an entire council or several seats on a council with the same kind of ballot, but a slightly different tabulation process. Well, actually the same tabulation process, just a different winning threshold.
Okay, so we are actually running a little ahead of schedule, so why don't we start the presentation?
Okay. Well, I think you suggested, is it Fran?
Bren.
Bren, how to pitch it to someone, and so I think what I want to do is start with just like if I had 1 minute to tell you about ranked choice voting. And actually, if you have 1 minute, it's a great amount of time because usually we have less than 1 minute when we're canvassing at a fair or in a park or during a march or a parade. But I would say, if I was approaching someone, I would say, do you know about ranked choice voting? And often they say, what? You know, what is that? And so I say, it's a simple change to the way that we currently vote. Right now, when you cast your ballot for a single candidate. With ranked choice voting, you can rank the candidates in order of preference. So you vote for a first choice, and then you make a series of backup choices, second choice, third choice, and so on. If your preferred candidate doesn't receive enough support, your vote automatically transfers to your next available choice. So this ability to rank your candidates in order and in comparison to each other solves some very big problems with our current system. Vote splitting and spoiler candidates result in many elections where the winner never receives a majority of the votes cast.
So,
This means that more than half the voters actually selected someone on their ballot who wasn't elected, right? They actually voted voted against the person who was elected to represent them, basically. So I always say, like, is it any wonder that people are so disillusioned and a little disengaged in our system? We don't have evidence that voting works, right? If so many, and actually I'll show you a slide later about how many states elected their electors with less than 50% of the vote in the states.
Can you go back and define the two things?
Instant runoff. Oh, vote splitting and spoiler
Yeah,
candidates.
yeah.
Actually,
we're about to.
that's what this slideshow is mostly about, is to explain the difference between vote
Okay.
splitting and spoiler candidates. So if you've ever supported a non-traditional candidate, you sometimes worry that you're throwing your vote away. People will even tell you you're wasting your vote or that you're helping to elect someone you don't even like, but because you're not voting for a front runner who could beat them. So with ranked choice voting, you can vote for your preferred candidate. You have a ballot that can actually reflect your true political priorities. So your vote is never wasted. The ballot represents your beliefs. Your vote stays intact and can't be thrown away.
It's a smart ballot, so to speak.
Is a winner take all?
The winner will, once there's a majority, we'll go through some examples so you can, but the winner in a single seat election is a majority, which is 50% plus one, right? 50% of the valid ballots plus one vote is the winning, it wins you your seat.
Oh, let's, you stay up front, I'll do the
You'll do
clicking.
Okay, it'll advance. So this is supposed to be a quick 20-minute introduction, like the ranked choice voting 101. So we'll talk about the problem. We'll talk about the problems of vote splitting and spoiler candidates. We'll go through the solution in quite a bit of detail, especially trying to disentangle any kind of confusion that you might have about how the votes are tallied. We might have time to talk about the campaign a little bit, the statewide campaign of Voter Choice Massachusetts, and we'll take your questions and show you some of the research. So Voter Choice Massachusetts is a nonpartisan nonprofit educational organization, almost entirely of volunteers, that is advocating for election reforms that result in fairer outcomes. We have people on the whole political spectrum, so we have Democrats and Republicans, Bernie supporters, Hillary supporters, independents, Rainbow, Green Party. We have the gamut at our members. There's a great history in Massachusetts of ranked choice voting. It was actually invented by an MIT professor, but this is what's important actually, I think, for this area. In 2002 and 2004, there were non-binding ballot questions, non-binding resolutions that were asked to, that our representatives were asked to vote in favor of this, and it won by 65 and 68% of the vote back then. So many times when we're in situations in Western Mass and we ask people, have you heard of ranked choice voting? Sometimes they don't hear what you say, but many of them have a long history of supporting this, and a lot of it comes from that. So we're leading the way, right? I think sometimes people think Boston is the leader of this state, but in this movement, it really is the Pioneer Valley. We're kind of known as that progressive, active, engaged populace out here, and we can make it happen. And we're hoping to engage all of you as the ambassadors for ranked choice voting too. Raise your hand if you recognize any of these people. So this is obviously you can go through it. This is the classic spoiler example. So you want to know the difference between a spoiler and vote splitting. A spoiler candidate is someone like Ralph Nader who gets the smallest percentage of the vote, but it's just enough in such a close race. I mean, this is an incredibly close race. It was 537 vote difference in Florida. But it's enough to tip the balance. So sometimes, it's commonly called a spoiler, but sometimes they call it a kingmaker. If Ralph Nader stays in the race, he can swing it one way or the other. He leaves the race, it swings the other way. Do you want to?
Yeah, and the paradox being that the candidate who has the least amount of support has the greatest influence over the outcome of that election.
Yeah, this is a huge security vulnerability with plurality voting. And it happened in 2000 only in the state of Florida. It happened in 2016 in 13 states.
Well,
13 states.
remember, 24% of the electoral votes.
Yes. 13 states, the same exact scenario where the difference between the winning and the two front runners was less than the votes given or votes received by
Was it
some
Jill
of the minor-
Stein?
Say it again?
Was it Jill Stein?
Jill Stein and Gary Johnson.
Right.
Yeah. We could go through that because I think they've got the spoiler. I mean, people still, well, actually at one meeting someone said the reason why they're here is they want ranked choice voting to happen because they want to stop arguing with their son-in-law about Ralph Nader. Exactly. But this is the, and if you have any questions about it, I'll answer them, but I want to move on. This Andy is the author of this fantastic map that shows where the states, those states we talked about, 13 states in one congressional district, where that same spoiler effect was in effect. And you can see 142 of the electoral votes were that close.
Wow.
And it's talked about like this all the time, the headlines. Jill Stein spoiled the 2016 election for Hillary Clinton. How Gary Johnson and Jill Stein helped elect Donald Trump. You know, Jill
I can't read
Stein,
who the
Clinton,
quotes are from. Can you actually clarify?
where they're from?
Yeah, what journalism is saying these statements?
Yeah,
I'm
that,
curious.
CNN. Somebody from CNN.
yeah, they're commentators from CNN.
Yeah.
One of them is CNN. Actually, this
I think one of those is the Post. I'm not sure.
that's a good question, though.
Yeah, I'm kinda
Matthew
curious.
Rosa is a Post commentator, and then this person is called Jason Brown. I don't know where he's from.
So wouldn't two spoilers have like negated each other?
Possibly. But here's the thing about it. If you don't have a ranked ballot, you don't know how many people decided to play a strategy with their vote, right?
And you don't know how many people would have stayed home instead of voting for one of the other front runners.
Right. I mean, without it actually in play, we can guess. You know, we have the evidence about exit polls, but we guess about what it might
What
have
about taking a
happened.
poll right here and asking if anybody knows anybody who stayed home and didn't vote because of the choices? Like even in your own immediate, like I know two people that were like, I'm not voting.
Yeah.
They were like
really
Yes.
Well, and in 2016, 2 million Democrats didn't vote that voted in 2012. And Trump won in those 3 states, in Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin by 70,000 votes. I think it was an average of 4 to 6 votes per precinct. I mean, it's crazy. The crazy numbers are crazy. But it's not the only place, right? It's not the only place that there's a plurality problem. In many circles, we think Donald Trump would probably never have been the Republican nominee in 2016 had we had a ranked ballot for the Republican primary. This was a really crowded field, and the more moderate Democrats split the vote. So here's the difference in the vote splitting. In spoiler candidates, it's a single candidate with very, very small support, but just enough to throw a very close election. With vote splitting, it's where there's a wide field and actually many strong candidates who then, people have to decide which one am I going to vote for, and it might split that moderate centrist part of the party and let someone who's more radical rise up.
The Republican.
And this is a quote from the Washington Post. A giant field of Republican candidates meant that votes in the early primaries were split widely, making it hard for anyone to get a majority. And in fact, most of the early primaries were won with percentages around 30%. Nothing close to a majority.
The system is almost parliamentary, like it's in the sense of your series of rounds of voting are like forming a coalition government or something, it's
With
like
ranked choice.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, when you're electing a multi-seat council with ranked choice voting, that could be very much the case. You're more likely to get proportional representation. Well, you do get proportional representation in proportion to voter support. So this is raise your hand if you recognize these people. Martha Coakley won this Democratic primary with 42%, far less than a majority of the votes cast. Grossman and Berwick were more on the progressive end of the Democratic Party and probably split that progressive end between them. Had they together, they had over 50%, 57%. And there is anecdotal evidence that people said, Steve Grossman was my strong second choice. I supported Berwick at the convention, but I'm so frightened that Coakley's gonna blow another campaign. I'm leaning toward Grossman just to block her. So there was this sense that there was a stronger choice, and that the majority of voters actually supported someone other than the person who was put forward into the general election. That's a classic vote splitting situation. So this is actually this year, right? In 2018 in the 3rd Congressional District, what towns are we talking about?
It's up in,
Middleman?
it's Nikki Sangus's district.
Northeast Shore, yeah. So look at how many people are running who want that seat. They're all Democrats.
That's one seat.
This is one seat.
Yeah.
So at that primary, how many? I do a quick count of that. The winner might win with 12% of the vote. That means that 88% of the voters will have voted for someone other than the person who they'll have to then decide among, or to choose or not to choose in November. So, can we go back to that slide? Because one argument is that ranked choice voting would be really good to unite a party, right? To find out where do most of the voters fall, right? Like what kinds of issues really resonate with them. The great thing about having this many candidates in a race, if we had ranked choice voting, think about all the issues that get brought up. We're not going to just talk about the most divisive things. We're going to say, oh, maybe Keith St. John really cares about the environment, and Lori Trahan is really concerned about education, and that it brings more issues onto the table. So this many engaged people in our democracy, I want to stand up and down and shout yay, right? But having to choose just one of them is just such a vulnerability.
And the fact that since you can end up with somebody winning with as low as 12, 11, 10%, this is the paradox where you would want to think that more voices equals more choice for voters, and that by necessity a democracy has a lot of ideas on the table, but the paradox being that by actually having more candidates running, there's more chances for them to hurt each other and split up those votes in ways that lead to somebody winning with very, very low support.
Third district is actually north by New Hampshire, going from Fitchburg on the west to Lawrence on the east.
Way up there, yeah, so not the North Shore, but the north inside.
495 north.
Yes. So we talked about a national example, a statewide example. Here's the Boston mayoral preliminary candidates in 2013, which at this point, Boston became a majority city of people of color. 53% of the population in Boston were people of color at this point. It's actually growing now. And this diverse field represents that diversity in the population. In cities, when there are more than 2 people running, there's a preliminary
Cities
election.
Except for East Hampton.
Except for East
We're
Hampton.
the only city that doesn't.
And only one woman.
We don't do a preliminary.
That's a very recent change.
Despite being 51% of the population.
Well, yes, only one woman, but then look who gets through to the general election. The 2 white Irishmen get through to the general election with 35% of the vote. 65% of those voters supported someone other than the person they'll have to choose between, other than the 2 people they'll have to choose between. And they chose Marty Walsh in the November election. So this is a classic vote splitting example. In that, Charlotte Golar Ritchie, who was the only woman there and would have been had she had just a few more percentage points, might have been the first African American woman, first African American and first woman mayor of Boston. I mean, and so close. The issue was so bad that her supporters got together and they're trying to talk about who could we ask to drop out of this race? Who could we ask who could throw their support to her? And the Boston Globe found this out and was just horrified. But this is the state of our democracy, when people behind the scenes are trying to determine who the voters are going to have to choose between, or might choose between. So to force out black candidates, a historically disenfranchised group in a city that is majority people of color, is just the exact wrong direction that we should be moving into in this day and age. So I think this is 20 years of research on elections, all elections across the state of Massachusetts, where there have been more than 2 candidates running. These are the percentages that have been won by non-majority winners. I think the average across the board is 41%. We are living in a state where 41% of our elected officials are elected without 50% of the vote. So it's a big problem and it's fixable. So the big news is, or the important thing is that we tend to blame candidates, right? Oh, we want to force this person out and they'll throw their support behind it. Or we blame voters. Don't vote for that person, you're throwing your vote away. And really, people are just wanting the ballot to be able to represent their political priorities. They want their representatives to represent their political priorities. It's the system that is broken. This plurality, this old-fashioned plurality voting system is really broken. I was talking to Rob on the way down here and I said, in 1782, or was it 1787, when Hamilton and Jefferson were having this argument about, and the parties were formed, the only voters were land-owning white men, most of whom owned other human beings, right? Like that, it might have worked to have just 2 parties then. But our society is far too diverse right now, and growing in diversity, that a 2-party system is just, it's antiquated as a landline, even more so. You want to say something else about this slide, or it says it all?
Yeah, pretty much said. The only thing that we haven't mentioned, which we can get into more, but because of that dichotomy between those 2 polar sides, what happens as in the dynamic of campaigning is that candidates are trained to differentiate themselves as much as possible from their opponent, right? So it's always vote for me, I'm the best. Don't vote for that person, they're pure evil. They're gonna bring hellfire forth, or whatever it may be. And this is a constant tone of our elections. When you have now more candidates who are viable, and the disincentive for candidates to try to slander each other, but instead the incentive for them to try to pick up votes from the bases of their opponents by saying, oh, okay, I know you may not vote for me as your first choice, but would you consider putting me as your second choice, then the tone of campaigns now changes as well. So the system we have has a built-in incentive for negative campaigning. That's something that I'm personally involved with this group in order to fix, because I want people to be able to talk to their neighbors and their family members without wanting to strangle each other, right? I think we all want that.
Yeah, the candidates tend to find in a ranked choice voting election, candidates tend to find the issues that have much more broad-based support. And in our system, in our current plurality system, candidates find the most splintering divisive issues, and they target those. So the solution.
Yeah, and the really important issues never get touched.
You can go past
Oh.
this one. Do you want to show it?
Well,
Yeah, these are just a few short videos. Actually, if you go to the Voter Choice Massachusetts website, these videos are right on the front page, I think, or about RCV. There's a page, and they have these nice, very short videos.
We'll play the first one after we walk through the steps.
Okay. So the solution that we're proposing, the solution that has been proven actually to fix many of these problems of vote splitting and spoiler candidates is ranked choice voting, which allows you to vote for candidates in order of preference. So a ballot might look like this, and if you voted for Candy, you saw this form of ballot. This is not the only kind of ballot. Sometimes you'll see all the candidates listed in 3 columns, but if I like candidate C the best, I just blacken in that bubble under the first choice. If I like the candidate A, I think that person will do a good job. If this person doesn't get elected, I'll vote there. And say I don't like candidate B at all. I'm not going to even, and I can rank as many or as few of the candidates as I want. People, actually, in my Candy election, there were people who only voted for one candidate, right? And I had kindergarteners who filled this ballot out with absolutely no help except for how to spell Reese's, because they were writing in Reese's. So, and with no mistakes, like this is really a simple way to vote.
Oh, you wanna do your
So this is just, and maybe you'll get to it, but in our voting today,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of touched on it, people still have a problem with voting today when you only have to fill in one bubble.
Yes.
And so is there a way around that? Is it like hard driving education? Do you start small so people get used to it? Like, what's the general consensus of how to get there from here?
It's a great question, and there's a website called rankedchoicevoting.org, and there are so many free resources for voters, for election officials, for candidates, and they actually also offer free consultation to municipalities that are implementing ranked choice voting. And on that website, they have so much about voter education, simple ways to explain it to the voter. The other thing is that the scanning machines that can read a ranked ballot also read if there's a mistake, and it can spit it back out, and the person can take the ballot to an election official and get a new one and get some education.
2 ones.
Exactly. If I fill in 2 here, my ballot is invalid, right? If I fill in all across here, it's not invalid, it's just that if this person gets thrown out, I don't have a backup choice, right? And if I fill in 2 here, but I have a clear first choice, I have a clear first choice. So there are all kinds of ways that the election officials are trained to, voter intent, to determine voter intent on a ranked ballot. Question?
Has there been any talk about maybe redesigning the ballot to be more intuitive to people or more visually communicative?
You want to talk about that?
There's always talks about how to make it more intuitive, how to make voting easier, how to make it more accessible. Usually the place where it gets limited is in just the sheer amount of volunteer effort that it takes to do blanket voter education, and the resources that are provided to election officials and how they get out their voter instructions as well. So yes, there's absolutely a core of experts looking into how to make the design of it kind of foolproof. So if that's something that you're interested, we can kind of discuss more later, but There's
It's less about foolproof and more about just, you know, I mean, I have a graphic design degree and I work in marketing, and like my whole world is communicating people, and often it's through visual things, and I feel like just filling in the bubble, especially when you've got 3 rows now that you have to fill in bubbles, it's more counterproductive in a way. I don't know what it takes to change the system of, you know, this is what our ballot looks like, but
In Cambridge, Massachusetts, all 26 candidates were listed in down the row with 26 columns. You could rank all 26 of them. It's, you know, very small circles, and I think their spoiled ballot rate was less than half of 1%.
well, that's good.
So I mean, they've been doing it for 70 years. They've been using the computerized scanning equipment just since 1997. But
Very educated out there too.
Yeah, right.
perhaps the majority
It can be
is, but-
higher in other areas, but it's actually very similar to spoilage that occurs on regular plurality ballots, where you just pick one.
I like when they send those things in the mail and you, like with the questions, and you fill them out, you know, because you read them ahead of time, the pros and cons, the ballot questions,
Sample
and then
ballots.
you go with your cheat sheet and you fill it out. I mean, I can imagine in Cambridge, maybe a local paper or something ran on the issues, and so people probably ranked them on the article. That would be very helpful.
Well, sample ballots in general are available from city and town websites nowadays, so you can
Yeah,
always
but
go get them.
sometimes a name, you need a face, so they'll have the face and they'll have a rundown of what their issues are, and you can just rank them right there before you even get to the polls.
yeah. So that's incumbent on town officials sending out that kind of useful educational material and having the funding to do so. So any implementation effort has to be dovetailed with a good voter education funding to make sure that information gets disseminated well.
You could pair it up with mail-in ballots too, like Oregon has.
And the whole state of Colorado, or I don't know if it's the whole state, but Denver, there was a, on that same website I was talking about, there's a really good video of voter education, or actually it was just a meeting of all these election officials. There were people from San Francisco, people from Minneapolis, and they were getting together with the Denver officials to say, how would this work? And all the other people from San Francisco and Minneapolis were so jealous about having 100% mail-in ballots in Denver County. They're like, oh, if only we got our ballots by mail.
Then you'd have time to think about it.
Wrong direction.
Oh, this is just the next slide.
Oh,
So
right, so how they're counted, right? So this is, we're pretending here we have 4 candidates. This is election for a single seat election, so sometimes the ranked choice voting again is the overall arching term. This might be also called instant runoff. We gather all the ballots, we tally all the first choice votes. You can see that our dark gold candidate there, our dark orange candidate has 55% of the votes. It's more than 50%. We have a winner in the first round. People may have ranked all these candidates in order. The rankings are never looked at. As soon as there's a person with more than a majority, then we have a winner. But often, especially when there's 4 candidates in a race, there isn't someone who has 50% of the votes in the first round. So what happens is a 3-step process. We tally the votes, we ask if there's a majority. If there's not, we eliminate the lowest vote getter. So we're gonna take the 5%, the light gold candidate who didn't get very many votes, and we look at all those voters' second choices. In this simplified example, we're pretending that all of them were for the dark orange person. And so you can see her votes transferred to that dark orange candidate. We do the transfer, we tally again. Do we have a majority? No. So we do the same thing again, eliminate the lowest vote getter. This time it's the light purple candidate who had 20% of the votes. Again, for simplicity's sake, we're pretending that these voters, these purpley candidates, were kind of attractive to the purpley voters, right? That they must have had something in common or some issues in common that resonated with people. And so her votes go to this candidate and she becomes the winner with 55% of the vote. And the majority of the voters are now happier with this result. Certainly the dark gold candidate isn't happy with this result, right? She would have won in the first round. but the majority of voters, and our elected officials are there for us, right? The will of the majority of the voters is determined in this way. Question?
So why stop at 50% or 51%? Like, is there a way you could say someone needs 70% of the vote to win?
I suppose you could, but our constitution is for
Is for a simple majority.
right.
How would you, question is,
Santa
how would
Fe-
you transfer the remaining votes?
I
from
don't
the
know.
opposing?
I'm just being a devil's advocate. But,
Well, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, they just used ranked choice voting for the first time to elect their mayor this past election cycle, and they had, were there 4? I think there were
5.
there were 5 candidates running, and Alan Weber had 36% or 39% after the first round. And so they did the elimination, and it actually went down to the last 2 candidates. It often does go to the last 2 to get a majority winner. But by the final round, he had 66% of the vote. So he realizes, oh, I was ranked first, second, or third on more than 2/3 or about 2/3 of my constituents. That's a really much better mandate, right? Like that's really good information for the candidate to know that you had that kind of resonance.
And as a smart ballot, the candidate now knows where they picked up those second and third votes from, so they know the issues of their constituents in much more fine detail.
Alan Weber is an Amherst College graduate.
Is he really?
Yeah.
How about that?
Should we show
You want to play this one?
Okay.
If it plays,
Just click on it.
you just click on the. We'll see if it works. I embedded this or tried to embed it in.
It's not on the next slide, is it?
No. But this is another one too. This is part of the voter education. You were asking about voter education. That video is part of the voter education when Minneapolis instituted ranked choice voting from 2009. And then there are many of them, many of those really short little clips. Is it?
I'm going to play this one. So what do I just?
It should be if you just click the screen, the dark part. Can you see the dark part there?
You could require 2/3 or something, but then you have to have a backup plan in case they don't get it, right?
Right.
I think we're good, right, Liz?
Yeah. Do you want to?
What's the next? I forget what the next slide is.
Next is just how those elections would potentially have changed under RCP.
Oh, yeah. I don't think we. Do you want to talk about the campaign, or do you want? Oh, we're going to do canvassing. We're going to try to do the canvassing.
So what time are we at right now?
6:53. Okay. We're doing well.
Yeah.
Questions about this?
Let's take
Any other questions?
let's take 10 minutes for questions, general questions. So, does
People
this
asked during the presentation.
does this make sense?
I did have a question. You were bringing this up as an intuitive alternative ballot choice. I like this layout.
Andy found that.
Yeah, so there's, Fair Vote has provided a number of examples of what they found to be better ways to lay out ballots. And this one in particular is I believe it's designed for use with older machines that want to understand the compact format. They can basically run these as 4 separate races. And then you use, get an export of that data and then can run through the ranked choice.
So, yes, question.
I want to bring this up, it's not directly related, but, I mean, you're talking about, like, the scanner machines. We have so many electronic machines across the country. I mean, I think they can set it up so people can do it, but.
Can you speak up, please?
It's a kind of, election reform that we need, is to get rid of the electronic machines too, but I suppose you're not dealing with that.
So Paul maybe can speak to that.
That's right up my alley. I would like to do away with all electronics, except for the scanners. I mean, scanners, if you can have yeah.
Well, so we have tabulators in Massachusetts. So everyone has a paper ballot.
Yeah.
Okay, those are always there, so you can always do a hand count to check things.
Right.
And it's, You feed them into a tabulator that records the votes. So it's not a computer where.
Yeah, but I'm worried about the rest of the country, I'm not worried about Massachusetts.
Well, I would say there is one advantage to scanners, and that is that they create a digital ballot image that could then be used to audit the hand count of paper ballots. So you've got a second means of assessing the validity of the vote.
So we had some questions at the beginning, maybe we'll take some time to answer those now. So like, what are the common pros and con arguments for and against ranked choice voting? One of them we kind of brushed on, which was, it's complicated. I'm never going to be able to explain this to my spouse or my grandmother or my mom, or, you know, they voted the same way all decades. Why do we need to change things? And like we said, that's a common misconception, because something looks like it has a few extra bubbles to fill in. They think by necessity that means it's more complex. But I would argue to the contrary, it's actually more simple, because it takes into account a voter's natural inclination for how they think about voting. So when you only have the choice of filling in one bubble for a single candidate, what it forces is now for a voter to have to become kind of a political strategist and to try to game out what's the best use of my vote. Do I put it towards the candidate that I really like, or do I put it towards somebody who can beat that other person? And now a voter now has to become this, this gamer of the system, right? Which feels weird, it feels uncomfortable, it feels like you don't get what you want out of your vote. So with a ranked ballot, you are simply giving a voter the opportunity, they don't have to use that opportunity, but if they want to express what they really feel in terms of their candidate preferences, right? In that way, it's a lot more simple. And like we said, there's analogies to, choose your favorite ice cream or your favorite color or whatever. So the complexity issue tends to come up more with when you go through the tabulation, but after we went through this purple and orange slides, how many folks are still a little hazy on the tabulation? Those 3 rounds where you go check for a majority.
You can raise your hand, because I'll show you
Yeah.
with the paper ballots if you want to see it again.
Yeah, we can do a
I can show
hand
you with the
count right
candy
here.
ballots.
Okay, I'm not, but
Okay.
I've also taken people with dementia,
Yeah.
early stages to vote, and this would be harder. I'm sorry, that's just the reality of it. I'm pro ranked choice voting. I think you have to, give and take some things here. But my question is there ever a choice, are there any known places where there's a choice for a simplified ballot if you want to have the old-fashioned ballot, you only have one choice versus doing the ranked ballot?
I suppose you could always give the voter the option to kind of cover up the other columns if they don't want to use them, but that would have to be the voter's choice to do that. It's rank however many or as few as you want.
So they could use it as a plurality ballot and only rank a first choice. And then if the person who they voted for,
You're talking about going in with somebody who knows who they want to vote for, that's all they know, you're training them to, find the person. It's a very difficult thing to do. There are exemptions made for having people go into the booth with someone and stuff, but that's a very tricky situation. So I was just wondering if that option to use another ballot has ever come up, but it does sound like it hasn't, it's not.
I think it would probably default to the same method of what you would do right now, which is have somebody accompany them and walk them through the steps.
That would have to start earlier though in
Yeah.
that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. This requires voter education, right? That is a key hurdle that we face as any reform movement is going to face when they're introducing something that not the entire population knows about. There's going to be a long period of doing voter education and doing mock elections where people get to practice and working with town clerks to send out educational materials. So I think that's a natural part of the process of any type of reform that you might discuss. So does that kind of get to the...
I just think there's not necessarily a good answer for that, and that's just a reality that has to be faced. It's a little bit of an oversimplification to say it's not more complex. It is more complex.
for some voters it will be, yeah.
Well, I think for simplicity, you don't have to, if you could say, it's important what your first, second, and third choice is. And you don't really have to talk about the tabulating part,
But it's a matter of, let's not worry about it for right now, I don't wanna get into it, but, I mean, it's more complicated than
But I think what you raise is an important point, because that would be a con argument, right? Like, this is the way people have voted for their whole lives, and now they're struggling with dementia, and they're aging, and now we're gonna change that system, right?
I mean, I guess if you, somebody already said this, but if they only wanted to vote for, cast a single vote, and there was someone coming in, they could just cast a vote in that first column and just ignore the rest.
Yeah, they could do that, right?
So,
I mean, I think the other idea is, to have a picture of the ballot that they take in with them. So it's already done and all they have to do is copy.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
that's a good idea.
Okay, any other questions?
So, in Massachusetts, is there an overall plan for how this would get executed? So would it be rolled out to local municipality elections first? Would it be off presidential years that we would roll it out? What is everybody's got a finish line that, for any of these kind of organizations. What would be the perfect scenario for you guys, like 20-something would be statewide, or do you have a date?
Yeah, we've been discussing that in great detail because it matters a lot. If you're talking about doing such a broad education effort as this, you have to be prepared for what it's going to take to get to that finish line and breaking down what incremental steps you have to take. So there's a few different paths that something like this can be proposed. So the first path is like the example of what Amherst did, where a city council or a commission will make a charter change. And that process usually takes some number of years. It's not the most, streamlined process to implement. So there's been a recurring bill in the legislature. It did not get out of committee this past session, but it has been proposed year after year and will be proposed again next year, which is called the Local Option Bill. And what that would do is just simplify the process for any city or town who wants to implement it by simple majority vote of the council or a town meeting. They could decide, we want to do our local elections with ranked choice voting. And there's a provision in there that they can switch back after 4 years if they're not satisfied with what the system was proposing. So that method makes it incumbent on towns and cities to now go through the process of implementing it, using it, and getting voters accustomed to voting with it. And then at a later date, you go forward potentially with a statewide implementation plan or a ballot question. And so a ballot question, if there's going to be one, would likely be in 2020. So we're, setting our sights. It's closer than you think.
I know.
Right? It feels like forever, but it could be around the corner. So there's a lot of thought and discussion that goes into something like that as well. You have to decide what the language of your bill would be, whether it covers presidential electors or not, for example. What seats does it cover? And then there's also making sure that all members of the legislature kind of understand what this question is about, and then doing voter education on it. So that's a longer term process, or I should say a shorter term process, larger amount of legwork and effort at the grassroots level that would have to be done. But that's why we're starting our voter education now, in anticipation that we would have to have a large group of people that are ready to mobilize and do signature collection or do some kind of large education. So, any other questions on that?
It seems unlikely but possible that no one gets a majority. Just if you've got 26 candidates,
Good question.
then what happens?
So that scenario is prone to happening when people don't use their full number of rankings.
Right.
So the process, let's say I what's called bullet vote, where I only vote for my top favorite and I don't use the rest of the rankings. And my candidate gets eliminated in the first or second round. I don't have a transfer available to me, so my ballot becomes exhausted. And every round, there's inevitably going to be some amount of fall off because of voters that didn't give further preferences, and so their ballots become exhausted. And so that's kind of what you're referring to, where if both candidates at the end, the two final remaining candidates, both get, 49 and 49% because the other 1 or 2% were exhausted, the way it's calculated is simply just by majority of the remaining available votes. So it would simply be the equivalent of a voter not turning out to a general election, saying I only have a preference in the primary for the first couple, 1 or 2 candidates on my ballot. After that, I don't care, and other people can make the choice for me. So that's what scenario you're describing.
Yeah. So it'd be the majority of the eligible ballots.
Exactly.
Not necessarily the majority of the voters.
Majority of remaining ballots. Yeah, which is why it's valuable to, to explain to people that even if you don't like a few of the candidates, usually you have some slight preference about which one might be better or worse. And so in those cases, we'd urge everyone to rank as far as they feel they're able to.
The usual term in this situation is people are abstaining from voting.
Right.
So when they don't fill the ballot all the way out, they've chosen to abstain from any further decisions in the process.
Which is something that happens in our current system as well. Like you see when people don't come out to vote in a general election because they didn't feel strongly about either candidate. Same problem, but you don't actually see that problem as readily with our current system because you never know who didn't turn out and who did, right? So you have to.
Well, you certainly have situations where, like, I go and for city council there are, 15 people on the ballot and I only know maybe 7 of them.
Right.
I'm probably likely to not vote for anyone that I don't know.
Yeah.
Just because that strikes me as being irresponsible. I'm not an educated voter and I probably shouldn't be voting.
That's a very fair assessment.
A lot of people have that attitude. That's pretty common.
And so that's why, if ranked choice voting were to be implemented, along with that has to come a wave of good voter education materials, good resources to get to know the candidates or the ballot questions, so that people are making an informed decision and they feel empowered to vote for any number, right? Because the driving factor of whether people vote or not is whether they understand it. And that's the same is true for a ballot question. If people don't understand what ranked choice voting is, they won't vote for it, right? They'll say, I don't feel comfortable making a decision on this and I'll abstain. And ultimately, a participatory democracy must have people educated enough to want to use their vote as fully as they can. So that's our goal, not just specifically with ranked choice voting, but with greater participation in general. Yeah.
Just following up on that, one thing that I found, so Santa Fe just had an election.
Yep.
And one thing that I thought was really interesting was actually, the number escapes me, you guys probably have it memorized, but the percentage of voters who utilized the complete ballot, like start to end. Like I have, because they had a great, like they have some awesome educational material that they sent out. Really good graphic designs, really easy to watch. Like follow, they have little animals, and it was super cute. But I don't know, like it's interesting because there is this conversation we have about like, oh well, we got to make sure that this happens and this happens. But there actually are plenty of like big cities with big complicated problems and diverse populations that actually managed to pull this off pretty well.
Yeah, and to the question about voting machines, it becomes a question, well, if we don't want to use a scanner and we have to go through this complex hand count, does that make ranked choice voting less viable because there's so much more involved in actually administrating the tabulation? But there's evidence from Minneapolis who's managed to reduce the time it takes to count a full ranked choice ballot by hand from, I think, 2 weeks at the start. They've gotten it down to a day. So there's plenty of resources already out there from cities that are solving this problem in real time. Yeah, so.
The other, what can I know you had a question.
Yeah, no,
Why don't you
it's
go
okay.
ahead. I was just gonna.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to address yours because 26 people are running for an election. Often they're electing more than one seat. And so the majority isn't, I mean, the winning threshold isn't a majority any longer, right? In Cambridge, Massachusetts, they elect 9 city councilors every 2 years. And so the winner needs 1/10 of the vote, or no, yeah, 1/10 plus 1 of the votes. And as soon as someone gets that threshold, they're elected. And the surplus votes are then assigned to those voters' second choice. And so when you look at the Cambridge results, you see this list of 9 people, all who have the exact same number of votes, which was the winning threshold.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, just for clarification, since both of these two are at-large city councilors. Yeah, this isn't actually like a thing that I'm sure you guys have faced that I think is really interesting. Is what do you do when you go in and you've got say you've got 5 people on the city council ballot that you really like. Well, I might choose to not vote for the one that I'm the most sure is going to win, because I want to make sure that the other 4 get my help. When you have something like this, when it's applied to an at-large election or a multi-winner election, the threshold for victory swaps from a majority to like a certain share of the votes. At which point, like, your victory is totally inevitable. And at that point, if somebody else comes and votes, some of your surplus votes can actually go to other people's second choices, so they don't have to feel concerned about that. That's a little bit more
So that, so that gets to the 2 variant uses between a single seat election and a multi-seat election. And the goal of using a ranked choice ballot in either of those scenarios is to minimize wasted votes. So you could have votes wasted if you're not, under plurality, if you're not voting for a front runner. And you could have votes wasted under multi-seat election if you're not, if a lot of people are voting for a very popular candidate, right? As soon as you hit what it takes to become elected, well, if I voted for that
this is
very
a-
popular candidate, yeah,
This is
go
a
for it.
5-seat election, so it's a fantasy election for the Nobel Prize selection committee, Peace Prize committee. So you have 5 possible winners, but you have 9 candidates. There are 31 ballots here. So you take those 5 seats and you divide it by 5 plus 1. Just take the 31 and divide it by 5 plus 1, and you get 5, and so you round it up to 6. What that does is it makes sure that 5 candidates, if they get at least 6, then everyone else has to get less than that amount. So those candidates are guaranteed to win. So that dash line was the threshold in this case at 6. Malala Yousafzai, who's a Pakistani girl who was attacked by the Taliban. She has a great name recognition. She got most of the votes to begin with, 9 I think. The red part is her surplus. She doesn't need those to win. So what happens in a multi-winner election is that the extra votes are transferred to the second choices of those voters. And so you end up getting some for Al Gore, some for Martti Ahtisaari, who's a Finnish president, Barack Obama, I'm sure you heard of him, Ellen Sirleaf, who was president of Liberia, Tawakkol Karman, who was an activist in Yemen, Kailash Satyarthi, who was the educator in India, who won together with Malala, and then Juan Manuel Santos, who was the Colombia president. All got a little bit of Malala's surplus votes.
we have a second winner.
Right, and we have a second winner, Ellen Sirleaf wins. So she has some extra votes as well, some surplus, and they all get transferred to Laima Gabawi, who was an activist in Liberia who worked with her. But now we come to a case where we don't have any surplus, we don't have another winner, we don't have surplus to transfer, so now we have to eliminate a candidate from the first one of the 9 to go, and that is Laima Gabawi. So all her votes go mostly for Al Gore and Tawakkol Karman, who was the other person that year who got the prize shared with those three. And then,
Still only 2 winners, so we have to do it again.
still 2 winners, we have to transfer another one. Finnish president goes, Carmen gets more. And then still don't have a winner. Barack Obama, he has the least amount of votes, so his votes transfer to Al Gore and Juan Manuel Santos. Al Gore is now a winner. He has some surplus votes. Those get transferred to 3 other people, but we also see we have our first exhausted ballot where someone didn't choose to rank any additional candidates. So we have a little bit of votes that are exhausted. Still don't have any other winners, so we now recount. And the person with the least number of votes is Satyarthi, and transferring those votes, we end Juan Manuel Santos and Kawakal Carmen, who win. Carmen actually has slightly less than the threshold here, but because we've actually eliminated 4 of the 9 candidates, they're the 5th one that's left. So they're close, but not quite at threshold, but they do win.
The critical thing here being that for the voter, it's the same exact process. They just rank first, second, third down the line, and this all happens.
And so we actually get a very interesting distribution. If you look at the representation here, we actually have 3 women and 2 men, and we have someone from North America, South America, Africa, Southwest Asia, Southern Asia, and then Pakistan. I guess that's Southern Asia. So we have a geographic distribution as well.
So I
Did you
think
get your question answered?
Yeah,
Forget your question.
It's just a quick question, right? It's just, is anybody gonna complain that it's more expensive?
Good
It costs
question.
more to do
Great
rank
question.
voting?
So it actually potentially costs less, and that's because once you have the ability to run multiple rounds of an election, like a primary and a general, on one single ballot, you could feasibly eliminate the need for the primary and preliminary.
It's a good argument.
Now a local town or municipality doesn't have to administrate 2 elections. And this was actually a case that came up in Northampton last summer or the summer before, where they had to hold a special election to fill a vacancy. And that election was timed so that it happened in the middle of the summer when a lot of people are away. They had to hold a preliminary to eliminate down from, I think, 3 or 4 candidates to just 2. And then they had to hold a second general for the top 2. That whole process could have been expedited, and the town could have saved a lot of money if they just had everybody rank those 4 candidates on one ballot. And you'd have a single election with higher voter turnout, and it would cost half as much, theoretically. And in cities where this has been adopted, like San Francisco and Minneapolis, there's great data and statistics about how much they're saving in millions of dollars when you're talking about a large city. So, yeah.
I was gonna just, in the context of where we are, like East Hampton doesn't currently have preliminaries, and one of the consequences of that is that we could one day see a mayoral candidate who only got 20% of the vote in a 6-way race
Yep.
become mayor, and it might be somebody whose ideas about what they want to do with the city are way out of whack with what the vast majority of the voters would want. So that's a risk, and there's been talk from time to time of people saying, well, we should have a preliminary like every other city in Massachusetts. But the pushback from that is always, well,
It costs
that's
more.
where are we going to get the money to do
Yeah.
that? That's just extra money that we have to spend.
And there's actually been a pattern of cities petitioning the legislature asking to cancel their preliminaries because of budget reasons. So I think 14 or so in the last several years, and about 13 of those have been granted because cities and towns just don't sometimes have the money to hold an election for narrowing down such a small number of seats anyway, right? So,
So do they resort to a ranked choice at that point, or
no, they simply just have a general.
And so they run the risk of
getting that extremist?
exactly.
Yeah.
plurality winners
That
being
outlier.
elected. And that does happen on a regular basis, so it's that's what's the most important thing? So the preliminaries were considered to be a good government move when they were instituted a century ago in Massachusetts. But they have that extra cost, and they also have the problem that you almost always have a somewhat different electorate who show up for the preliminaries than show up for
Right.
the general election.
It has the potential to disenfranchise people who don't have the time to come to 2 elections and find childcare or whatever it may be for taking that time off for. So, you had a question?
More of just sort of the practical application of should this come into being. Is there maybe, excuse me, some sort of provision for, I don't know, like that? So you have volunteers now that run, you know, election stations in various places, and would it be possible / legal / for a volunteer that might be someone who works there anyway, to have a little education station at the polling place and say, if you don't know how to do this, I can teach you how to do it before you go into your booth with your ballot?
Well, all the poll workers will be trained to do that. I mean, part of that site I was talking about, the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, has all education material for the poll workers to do exactly that. So they have the layers of training about how to be fair and impartial, and all the multiple people who are looking at every ballot, and also then how to teach people to use that ballot.
So, we're getting close to our time. What was your, I'll take one more question.
How do we get the local option bill out of committee?
Good question. Well,
Who do you know?
Yeah, it comes down to the question of, do legislators care enough? Do they see that enough of their constituents want this to happen? Are people taking grassroots steps to make it happen in their communities? Are petitions coming towards the legislature to do this on an elective basis? That's the process through which we get committees to bump things out, and in some ways we have a notorious problem with this, where a lot of bills, it's not just electoral issues, but it's all kinds
Bottle
of bills
bill.
that don't get pushed out of committee. So often it does come down to a grassroots movement like a ballot question.
Right, the currently elected officials have no incentive to change the system that elected them.
Right.
It's going to be the voters who decide that this needs to change, and put enough pressure and educate each other enough so that maybe we start running for office ourselves and get there to make those changes, but that we make this happen. We make it happen. And actually, that's what Voter Choice Massachusetts is trying to do, is educate people so that we can make it happen.
You can also call your legislature and ask them to vote it out of the committee.
And we
That's
talked about this
a higher lift than the committee deciding to push it out to the floor, and we're past that point.
So on that note, before we wrap up our question and answer section and talk a little bit more about how to go out and talk to people about ranked choice voting, because that is part of the grassroots movement, is talking to as many people as you know, and your neighbors and your family, and just teaching people about it. So we have little cards if you're interested in being involved in some type of grassroots way. We have, take one of these cards, and there's a few action items that you can offer to do, like simply hosting a house party, or writing a letter to a local newspaper, things like that.
Page.
So, yeah, a way to get involved.
And when, can we maybe just, at the very beginning, someone asked, like, what's the simple way to explain this? And maybe we could just find a partner, just turn to someone, and one of you say, have you heard of ranked choice voting? And the other, just give it a try. See where you get tongue-tied, take turns. It's very low, no pressure, low pressure, just give it a try.